For the last few days, we've been talking about how America became involved in World War II. It started with Japan bombing Pearl Harbor. Today, we're going to be talking about what life was like in America during the time of the war for different groups of people and things that it affected. So, I want you to be listening to different aspects of life and how it affected them while we read. Here we go. During World War II, more than 15 million Americans served in the military. Many millions more spent the war years at home, far from the battlefields. Winning the war depended on mobilizing the home front to support the supply the armed forces. Mobilizing for war, training recruits. In 1941, the military's first task was to train forces for combat. Army, Navy, and air bases were built all over the country. Recruits were trained to fight in the jungles of the Pacific, the deserts of North Africa, and the towns and farmlands of Europe. Women joined all the armed services. Women pilots logged 60 million air miles ferrying bombers from base to base, towing targets, and teaching men to fly. Although women were not allowed in combat, many served close to the front lines. A wartime economy. Even more than World War I, the government controlled the economy during World War II. Government agencies set the price of goods, negotiated with labor unions, and decided what should be produced. The War Production Board helped factories shift from making consumer goods to making guns, ships, aircraft, and other war materials. Automobile makers, for example, switched to producing tanks and trucks. A Nazi leader once scoffed that Americans can't build planes, only electric iceboxes and razor blades. He was wrong. In 1942 alone, American workers produced more than 48,000 planes and shipped more than 8 million tons of goods. To control shortages and ensure that enough raw materials would be available for wartime production, the government imposed rationing, or limits on certain goods that people could buy. The government gave Americans ration coupons to purchase coffee, sugar, meat, gasoline, and other goods. When people ran out of coupons, they could not buy the items until new coupons were issued. Consumer goods became scarce. To combat food shortages, many Americans planted victory gardens. At the height of the war, more than 20 million victory gardens produced 40% of all vegetables grown in the country. To pay for the war, the government raised taxes. Also, as was the case in World War I, the U.S. government borrowed money from millions of American citizens by selling war bonds. Americans could buy a bond for a certain price with the expectation that they could redeem the bond from the government after 10 years for a profit. In the meantime, the government would then use this money from bond sales to pay for the war. Movie stars took part in drives to sell bonds and boost patriotic spirit. The war quickly ended the Great Depression. Unemployment fell as millions of jobs opened up in factories. Minority workers found jobs where they had been rejected in the past. Women and African Americans joined the war effort. If you can drive a car, you can run a machine. Newspapers and magazines echoed this call to American women to work for victory. Why do we need women workers? Asked the radio announcer. You can't build ships, planes, and guns without them. Women responded to the urgent demand for their labor. Almost 5 million women entered the workforce. They replaced the men who joined the armed services. Many women worked in offices. Millions more kept the nation's factories operating around the clock. Some welded, ran huge cranes, and tended blast furnaces. Others became bus drivers, police officers, and gas station attendants. The image of Rosie the Riveter, a fictional factory worker, became a symbol of American women's contribution to the war effort. And there's a picture of Rosie at the bottom of the page. Because women were badly needed in industry, they were able to win better pay and working conditions. The government agreed that women and men should get the same pay for the same job. Many employers, however, found ways to avoid equal pay. The war also changed fashions for women. Instead of wearing skirts on the job, many women dressed in trousers. They wore overalls and tied scarves around their hair. More importantly, war work gave many women a new sense of confidence. I will never regret my 2 years or more in the shipyards. It gave me a good start in life. I decided that if I could learn to weld like a man, I could do anything it took to make a living. From Nova Lee McKee. Fighting war abroad and discrimination at home. When the war began, African Americans rallied to their nation's cause, as they had during World War I. This time, however, African Americans decided to pursue a double V campaign. victory over the enemy abroad, and victory over discrimination at home. As industry geared up for war, factories replaced "No Help Wanted" signs with "Help Wanted" white signs. Such discrimination angered African Americans. In 1941, Philip Randolph, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, called for a protest march in Washington. The government, he said, will never give the Negro justice until they see masses, 10, 20, 50,000 Negroes on the White House lawn. Government officials worried that such a march would feed Hitler's propaganda machine. After meeting with Randolph, FDR ordered employees that did businesses with the government to end discrimination in hiring. As a result, the employment of skilled black workers doubled during the war. However, as black employment increased, so did racial tension. Thousands of Americans, black and white, moved to the cities to work in industry. Competition for scarce housing led to angry incidents. In 1943, race riots broke out in Detroit, New York, and other cities. Heroism in the military. While FDR acted against demonstration in hiring, he refused to end segregation of the races in the military. Nearly 1 million African Americans enlisted or were drafted. They had to serve in all black units commanded by all white officers. African Americans served heroically in all branches of the armed forces. One of the earliest heroes of the war was Dory Miller, an African American sailor serving in the battleship West Virginia. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, Miller dragged his wounded captain to safety. Then, though he had no training as a gunner, Miller manned a machine gun to defend his ship against enemy planes. For heroism in action, Miller was awarded the Navy Cross. In the Army, African American soldiers formed artillery and tank units. African Americans in the Navy served as runners' mates and helped build bases in the Pacific. African American Marines helped defend American posts against Japanese attacks. The Tuskegee Airmen were African American fighter pilots who trained at Tuskegee, Alabama. By the end of the war, the Tuskegee Airmen had destroyed or damaged about 400 enemy aircraft. The contribution of African Americans to the war effort increased their determination to win justice at home. After the war, black veterans would be at the forefront of the renewed campaign for civil rights. Problems for other Americans at home. The war brought suffering to many Japanese Americans. Most lived on the West Coast or in Hawaii. Many of those on the West Coast were successful farmers and business people. For years they had faced prejudice, in part because of their success. Japanese American relocation camps. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, many Americans questioned the loyalty of Japanese Americans. Some thought they might act as spies and help Japan invade the United States. No evidence of disloyalty existed, yet President Roosevelt signed an order allowing the Army to move Japanese Americans from their homes to relocation camps. Many were American citizens by birth. Later, a court case challenged the order, but the Supreme Court decided in Korematsu versus the United States that such an order was constitutional in times of war. About 110,000 Japanese Americans were forced to sell their homes, farms, or businesses at great loss. "We didn't know where we were going," recalled Peter Oda, who was 15 at the time. "We didn't know what to take. A toothbrush, toilet supplies, some clothes, only what you could carry." In the camps, Japanese Americans lived in crowded barracks behind barbed wire. Japanese American service and compensation. Despite unfair treatment, thousands of Japanese American men served in the armed forces. Most were put in segregated units and sent to fight in Europe. There they won many honors for bravery. The 442nd Nisei Regimental Combat Team became the most highly decorated military unit in United States history. Years later, in 1988, Congress apologized to Japanese Americans who had suffered from internment or temporary imprisonment during World War II. Congress also approved compensation or repayment of losses in the amount of $20,000 to every survivor of the camps. German Americans and Italian Americans. Japanese Americans were not the only group to face wartime restrictions. About 11,000 German Americans and several hundred Italian Americans were also held in government camps as enemy aliens. Other German Americans and Italian Americans faced curfews or travel restrictions. Mexican Americans. A growing Mexican American population also faced problems. Because of the need for workers, the United States signed a treaty with Mexico in 1942. It allowed the recruitment of Mexican laborers to work in the United States. Under this Bracero program, many Americans moved north to work on farms and railroads. In June 1943, A group of sailors on leave attacked some young Mexican Americans, beating them on the streets. This incident led to several days of rioting in Los Angeles. Newspapers blamed the violence on the Mexican Americans, but in her newspaper column, Eleanor Roosevelt argued that the riots were the result of long-standing discrimination against the Mexicans in the Southwest. Still, like other groups, Mexican Americans served bravely in the military during World War II. Despite lingering problems at home, Americans were united in their resolve to push on to victory in Europe and the Pacific. Your assignment today is to use the text to explain how the war affected each topic. So if you go back to the reading where it started, your first topic is about the military. So I would like you to tell me then what effects did the war have on the military? What kind of things did they do? For example, the military had to their first task was to train forces for combat in the jungles, the deserts, and on farmland. So you could write that for your first one. I'm giving it to you. The first task for the military was to train their forces for combat in the jungles, the deserts, and on farmland. So you need to go on and fill the rest of them out as well. So how did the war at home affect the economy? How did it affect women? How did it affect African Americans, Japanese Americans, German and Italian Americans, and Mexican Americans? This is in order of the reading. I just need one fact for each column and row. So make sure that you're telling me a way that each of these groups or each of these topics was affected by World War II. Go back in the reading if you need to.